Before the darkness, Cambodia was a kingdom of ancient temples and vibrant life, a fragile piece unaware of the storm gathering on its horizon. The Vietnam War spilled across the border, its violence and chaos becoming the fertile ground in which the seeds of a monstrous ideology would grow. In the chaos, a shadowy figure known as Saloth Sar, soon to be Pol Pot, began to consolidate power within the nascent Communist Party of Kampuchea. America's secret bombing campaign, intended to destroy enemy sanctuaries, instead drove countless terrified and enraged peasants into the arms of the Khmer Rouge. By 1975, the corrupt US-backed government of Lon Nol was collapsing, and the capital, Phnom Penh, was besieged by an army of disciplined, black-clad revolutionaries. On April 17, 1975, the Khmer Rouge entered Phnom Penh. The war was over, but a new, unimaginable horror was about to begin. Initially, some residents welcomed the young soldiers as liberators, offering them water and celebrating the end of a brutal civil war, completely unaware of their true intentions. Within hours, the liberators became tyrants. Using loudspeakers, they broadcast a terrifying order. The city was to be evacuated immediately for 3 days due to an imminent American bombing raid, a complete fabrication designed to empty the cities and begin their social experiment. The evacuation was swift and merciless. Patients were forced from their hospital beds, some still attached to intravenous drips, pushed onto the streets to join the exodus. The sick, the elderly, and the newborn were shown no pity. To falter was to be left for dead, or worse, executed on the spot by the cold-eyed teenage soldiers enforcing the march. This was the dawn of Year Zero. The Khmer Rouge, known only as Angkar or the Organization, declared that Cambodian society was to be purified. All history, culture, and personal identity were to be erased, resetting the calendar to zero. The cities, seen as corrupt vessels of capitalism and foreign influence, were to be abolished, their entire populations driven into the countryside to become a single class of agrarian laborers. The march out of Phnom Penh was a river of human misery stretching for miles. Under the scorching sun, millions were forced into the countryside with no food, water, or destination. The weak and the elderly were the first to perish, their bodies left by the roadside as a grim warning to others. This was not a relocation. It was a death march, the first great filter of Angkar's new world. Upon arrival in the countryside, society was brutally restructured. The population was divided into two groups: the base people, who were the rural peasantry, and the new people, the evacuated city dwellers. The new people were marked for suspicion, contempt, and eventual extermination. They were the intellectuals, the merchants, the educated, the ghosts of a world that Angkar had sworn to destroy. Family, the core of any society, was declared an enemy of the revolution. Children were systematically separated from their parents and sent to special labor camps, where they were indoctrinated with Angkar's brutal ideology. They were taught that the state was their only family, and that they should report any counter-revolutionary sentiment, even from their own mother or father. Love and loyalty were twisted into weapons of surveillance and betrayal. Life in the communes was a monotonous hell of forced labor. From before sunrise until long after sunset, men, women, and children were forced to dig irrigation canals until the rice paddies with primitive tools. The work was grueling, the pace relentless. Exhaustion was not an excuse. It was a sign of weakness, a bourgeois sentiment punishable by death. Starvation became Angkar's most effective tool of control and extermination. Rations were meager, often just a thin rice gruel called borba, providing nowhere near the calories needed for a day of hard labor. People withered away, their bodies consumed by malnutrition. Foraging for extra food, a frog, a snake, even insects, was considered theft from the collective and was punishable by immediate, brutal execution. Education and intellect were capital crimes. Anyone who wore glasses, spoke a foreign language, or had soft hands was deemed a potential enemy, an intellectual parasite from the old society. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, and artists were hunted down and murdered. The regime's goal was to create a society of illiterate, unquestioning peasants, and the first step was to eliminate anyone capable of independent thought. Religion was also targeted for total annihilation. Over 90% of Buddhist monks were murdered, and temples were desecrated, turned into prisons, or used as storage sheds. The nation's ancient spiritual heritage was systematically dismantled. In Angkar's new world, there could be no higher power than the state, no comfort in faith, only absolute obedience to the revolution's cold, godless directives. The slightest infraction could lead to a death sentence. Complaining about the food, expressing sadness for a lost loved one, or showing any sign of affection were all considered counter-revolutionary acts. Neighbors spied on neighbors, and children informed on their parents. Fear was a constant companion, a suffocating presence that permeated every moment of existence, turning every person into a potential executioner or victim. When someone was marked for death, they would often be taken away at night. The Khmer Rouge cadres would tell them they were being transferred to a new worksite or being sent for re-education. This lie was a cruel psychological torture, a final, fleeting moment of false hope before the victim was led to a quiet field on the edge of the village. These places would come to be known as the killing fields. Executions were carried out with brutal, cost-saving efficiency. Bullets were considered too precious to waste on the enemies of Angkar. Instead, victims were bludgeoned to death with iron bars, axe handles, or sharp-edged palm stalks. They were forced to dig their own grave before being struck down from behind, a final act of humiliation before being cast into the earth. The most infamous of these killing sites was Choang Ek, just outside Phnom Penh. Here, prisoners from the torture center Tuol Sleng met their end. To drown out the screams of the dying, Khmer Rouge executioners would hang loudspeakers in the trees, blasting revolutionary songs into the night. The cheerful, patriotic music provided a grotesque soundtrack to mass murder, a chilling symphony of death. Even children and infants were not spared. The regime's terrifying logic dictated that the entire family of an accused traitor must be eliminated to prevent future revenge. The Khmer Rouge had a chilling slogan for this practice: to dig up the grass, one must also remove the roots. At the killing fields, babies were brutally murdered, often by being swung against a tree trunk before being tossed into the same mass grave as their parents. Disease ran rampant in the communes, fueled by malnutrition, exhaustion, and a complete lack of medical care. The regime had murdered the country's doctors and banned Western medicine, promoting peasant remedies that were utterly useless against diseases like malaria, dysentery, and cholera. Sickness became another form of execution, a slow and agonizing death sentence for hundreds of thousands. As the regime's agricultural plans failed to produce the promised utopia, Pol Pot and the leadership grew increasingly paranoid. They blamed the failures not on their flawed ideology, but on hidden enemies and traitors within the revolution itself. This paranoia sparked a wave of brutal internal purges, with loyal Khmer Rouge cadres suddenly finding themselves accused of being CIA or KGB spies. To process these supposed enemies, the regime established a vast network of prisons across the country. The most notorious was a former high school in Phnom Penh, codenamed S21 or Tuol Sleng. Here, the paranoid fantasies of Angkar were transformed into a bureaucratic and highly organized system of torture and extermination. It was the dark heart of the Khmer Rouge state. Upon arrival at S21, each prisoner was meticulously photographed. These haunting portraits, thousands of which survive today, show men, women, and children staring into the camera in the final moments before their descent into hell. Their eyes hold a universe of terror, defiance, and confusion, a ghostly archive of the faces Ankar tried to erase from existence. The commandant of S-21 was Kang Kek-yu, known as Comrade Dutch, a former mathematics teacher turned meticulous monster. Dutch oversaw the prison's operations with chilling efficiency, demanding that his interrogators extract detailed confessions from every prisoner, no matter how fabricated. For Dutch, torture was not just about punishment. It was a bureaucratic process to produce the truth that the party demanded. Inside S-21, former classrooms were converted into tiny, squalid cells and large-scale torture chambers. Prisoners were shackled to the floor, forbidden to speak or even move without permission. The rules were designed to break the human spirit before the torture even began, reducing each individual to a state of absolute terror and helplessness. The methods of torture were barbaric and varied, designed to inflict maximum pain while keeping the victim alive long enough to confess. They included severe beatings, electric shocks, waterboarding, and the pulling out of fingernails. Interrogators worked in shifts, tormenting their victims around the clock until they broke, ready to confess to anything and name anyone just to make the agony stop. The goal of torture was to produce a confession. These were not documents of truth, but works of fiction, dictated by the interrogator and written down by the broken prisoner. Victims were forced to implicate their friends, families, and colleagues in vast, imaginary spy networks. These fabricated confessions were then used as justification to arrest and torture even more people, feeding the regime's insatiable paranoia. The guards and interrogators at S-21 were often teenagers, plucked from poor peasant families, and indoctrinated to believe that the prisoners were less than human. They were taught to suppress all empathy, becoming cogs in a machine of death. Many were just as trapped as the prisoners, living in constant fear that a single mistake or a moment of pity could make them the next victim to be shackled to the interrogation bed. Of the estimated 17,000 people imprisoned at S-21, only a handful are known to have survived. Once a prisoner had produced a satisfactory confession, their fate was sealed. They were loaded onto trucks, told they were being transferred to a new home, and driven to the Choang Ek killing field. Their meticulous records were stamped with the chillingly bureaucratic phrase, "smashed to pieces." The paranoia of the regime eventually consumed itself in a frenzy of internal purges. The eastern zone of Cambodia, bordering Vietnam, was deemed to be full of Khmer bodies with Vietnamese minds. In 1978, Pol Pot ordered a massive and savage purge of the region. Cadres, soldiers, and civilians were massacred indiscriminately in one of the most brutal episodes of the entire genocide. Emboldened by their perceived strength and blinded by racist ideology, the Khmer Rouge launched a series of violent cross-border raids into Vietnam. They massacred entire Vietnamese villages in a horrific manner, believing they could reclaim territory lost centuries ago. This foolish aggression would prove to be their undoing, as it provoked the wrath of their far more powerful neighbor. In December of 1978, Vietnam had had enough. A massive invasion force, backed by tanks and artillery, rolled across the Cambodian border. The Khmer Rouge army, weakened by years of internal purges and reliant on fanatical but ill-equipped child soldiers, was no match for the professional Vietnamese military. The regime that had terrorized a nation for 4 years began to crumble with astonishing speed. On January 7, 1979, Vietnamese troops entered a ghostly and deserted Phnom Penh. They had liberated a capital city that had been empty for nearly 4 years. As they explored the silent streets, they stumbled upon the horrific secret at its heart, the torture prison of S-21. Inside, they found bodies of the last victims, still shackled to their beds, and mountains of documents that would expose the regime's crimes to the world. As the world slowly learned of the atrocities, the scale of the Cambodian genocide became clear. An estimated 1.7 to 2 million people, nearly a quarter of the country's population, had been murdered or had perished from starvation and disease. The killing fields were unearthed, revealing pits filled with tens of thousands of skeletons. The evidence was irrefutable, the horror beyond comprehension. Though driven from power, the Khmer Rouge did not disappear. They fled to the jungles along the Thai border, and with support from China and, perversely, the United States, who saw them as a bulwark against Soviet-backed Vietnam, they waged a guerrilla war for another 2 decades. For the Cambodian people, peace remained a distant dream, and the perpetrators of the genocide remained at large, unpunished. Pol Pot, the architect of the genocide, was never brought to justice in a court of law. He died in 1998 under mysterious circumstances while under house arrest by his own former comrades. He lived out his days denying the extent of his crimes, claiming his conscience was clear. The man responsible for the deaths of millions died a quiet death, cheating the world of a final, public reckoning. Only in the 21st century did a semblance of justice begin. A United Nations-backed tribunal was established in Cambodia to prosecute the surviving senior leaders of the Khmer Rouge. Men like Comrade Dutch, the head of S-21, and Nguyen Chi, Pol Pot's second-in-command, were finally forced to face their victims in court. The trials were a painful but necessary step for a nation grappling with its own history. For the survivors, the trauma of the Khmer Rouge years is a wound that may never fully heal. They live with the ghosts of lost family members, the memories of starvation, and the scars of torture. Every Cambodian family was touched by the genocide, and the psychological weight of this history is a burden carried by every generation, a collective nightmare etched into the soul of the nation. Cambodia today is a country reborn, but it is also a country haunted. The killing fields and Tuol Sleng have been preserved as memorials and museums, stark reminders of the depths of human cruelty. They stand as a warning to the world of how quickly a society can descend into madness when fueled by a hateful ideology, absolute power, and the terrifying belief in the perfectibility of man. The journey from the cities to the fields was a brutal triage. Professionals were immediately suspect. A doctor who tried to help a sick person on the march risked exposing his background, a fatal error in a world where medical knowledge was a death sentence. People learned to hide their skills, to pretend to be ignorant, to erase their own pasts simply to survive the first few weeks of Angkar's rule. Communal living was enforced to destroy privacy and individuality. Everyone ate together, worked together, and slept in large, open barracks under the watchful eyes of the cadres. There were no personal possessions, no private conversations. The collective was everything. The individual was nothing, a mere component to be worked until it broke and then be discarded without a second thought. The regime's economic plan was a disastrous fantasy. They aimed to triple rice production through sheer brute force, ignoring weather patterns, soil science, and the physical limits of human endurance. The massive, ill-conceived irrigation projects often failed, leading to floods or droughts. This failure was never blamed on the plan, but on the workers, who were accused of sabotage and executed for their laziness. Ethnic minorities were targeted with particular viciousness. The Cham, a Muslim minority, were forced to eat pork, and their religious leaders were executed. The Vietnamese ethnic minority in Cambodia was almost completely exterminated. Angkar's vision was not only of a classless society, but a racially pure one, a monolithic Khmer identity forged through the blood of those deemed different or impure. The concept of romance or personal affection was a crime. Marriages were arranged by the state in mass ceremonies, often pairing complete strangers. Any unauthorized relationship was seen as a betrayal of the collective, punishable by death. Angkar sought to control the most intimate aspects of human existence, severing the bonds of love and replacing them with a cold, loveless devotion to the revolution. The only art permitted was propaganda. Revolutionary songs were played on loudspeakers from dawn to dusk, their lyrics praising Angkar and promising a glorious future that stood in stark contrast to the living hell of the present. Art was no longer for expression or beauty. It was a tool for brainwashing, a relentless audio assault designed to break the will and reshape the mind. For those in S21, the psychological torture was as devastating as the physical. Interrogators would lie to prisoners, telling them their families were safe and would be reunited with them if they just confessed. This sliver of false hope was a powerful tool, making the eventual betrayal even more crushing. The goal was to dismantle the prisoner's mind, to make them an accomplice in their own destruction and the destruction of their loved ones. Not all victims were Cambodian. A number of Westerners who had been in the country were also caught in the nightmare. Journalists, missionaries, and adventurous yachtsmen were captured, accused of being CIA spies, and sent to Tuol Sleng. Their detailed and entirely fabricated confessions of espionage were a point of pride for the regime, proof of their victory over a vast, imagined foreign conspiracy. The Khmer Rouge's isolationism was absolute. They cut Cambodia off from the entire world, turning the nation into a giant, self-contained prison camp. Embassies were closed, and foreign contact was forbidden. This secrecy allowed the genocide to proceed without interference, shrouded in a veil of silence. The suffering of the Cambodian people was a secret kept by their tormentors. Even after the Vietnamese invasion, the suffering was not over. The retreating Khmer Rouge laid hundreds of thousands of landmines throughout the countryside, a deadly legacy that would continue to kill and maim Cambodians for decades to come. The war officially ended, but the land itself remained a battlefield, seeded with hidden death, a final, spiteful act from a defeated regime. The international response to the discovery of the genocide was complicated and shameful. Due to Cold War politics, many Western nations, including the United States, continued to recognize the Khmer Rouge as the legitimate government of Cambodia at the United Nations for years. The victims were betrayed twice, first by their murderers and then by a world that chose political convenience over moral clarity. The process of healing has been slow and fraught with difficulty. For decades, the genocide was not taught in Cambodian schools, a collective amnesia born of trauma and political instability. The Khmer Rouge Tribunal, while significant, prosecuted only a handful of senior leaders, leaving thousands of lower-level cadres to live out their lives, often in the same villages as their surviving victims. Van Nath, one of the few adult survivors of S21, was spared because he was a painter. He was forced to paint portraits of Pol Pot. After his liberation, he dedicated his life to painting the horrors he witnessed inside the prison, creating a visceral, visual record of the torture. His paintings are a testament to the power of art to bear witness and to fight against the erasure of memory. The slogan, "To keep you is no gain, to lose you is no loss," perfectly encapsulated the regime's view of human life. It was a philosophy of absolute disposability, particularly for the new people. This phrase was repeated by guards as they led people to their deaths, a chilling mantra that justified the extermination of millions by reducing them to a simple, cold calculation of revolutionary utility. Children were not just victims, they were also molded into perpetrators. The regime preferred child soldiers, believing them to be more loyal and malleable, untainted by the memories of the old society. These children, some as young as 10, were responsible for some of the most heinous acts of cruelty, their stolen innocence replaced with a fanatical and brutal devotion to Angkar. The fall of Phnom Penh was not a battle, but a surrender. The Lon Nol government's soldiers, exhausted and abandoned by their American patrons, simply laid down their arms. The first 24 hours were a surreal mix of relief, celebration, and growing dread, as the city's inhabitants slowly realized their liberators were something far more sinister than they could have ever imagined. Medical supplies were destroyed along with the doctors who knew how to use them. In the New Cambodia, a simple infection or a broken bone was a death sentence. People watched their loved ones die from treatable conditions, helpless and unable to do anything. This medical void was a deliberate policy, a way to cull the population and reinforce a total, primitive dependence on the state. The Khmer Rouge obsession with water was central to their vision. They believed they could conquer nature and create a prosperous agrarian superpower by controlling the water supply through a vast network of dams and canals. This hubris led to ecological disaster and mass starvation, as their projects, built with slave labor and no technical expertise, were catastrophic failures. The regime systematically dismantled all forms of transportation and communication. Cars were destroyed, telephone lines were cut, and radios were confiscated. This policy was designed to prevent organized resistance and to isolate communities from one another, ensuring that no one knew the full scale of the horror unfolding across the country. Each commune became a self-contained island of suffering. The final days of S-21 were frantic. As the Vietnamese army approached Phnom Penh, Comrade Dutch and his staff worked to eliminate the remaining prisoners and destroy evidence. They murdered the last detainees and attempted to burn their vast archives of confessions and photographs. Their failure to destroy all the documents is the primary reason we know so much about the prison's inner workings today. The story of the Khmer Rouge is a horrifying testament to the power of ideology to justify unspeakable evil. It began with a utopian dream of equality and purity, but this dream could only be built on a foundation of corpses. It serves as a permanent, chilling reminder that the road to hell is often paved with the fanatical pursuit of heaven on earth. The memory of this genocide must not be forgotten. It is a debt owed to the millions who perished in the rice paddies, the torture chambers, and the desolate villages of democratic Kampuchea. Their silent screams echo from the killing fields, a warning to all of humanity about the darkness that can be unleashed when one group of people is given absolute power over another.